Hello, everybody. The session I'm going to be doing with Lee Rusznyak, which is about publishing your work using LCT. So let me just share my screen. And of course, I can't find the most recent one, which I'm not sure why. Oh dear. There we go. All right. Great. Can everyone see that? Excellent. So Lee and I are going to be looking at this topic that we've called learning the magical art of writing LCT papers for a non-LCT audience. Lee's is, I think you all know her, is the director of the LCT hub at WITS in South Africa. I am a lecturer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and I've also been a journal editor for 5 years of the Journal of Education. So I've seen a lot of papers that come through, that get submitted, and can have some insight into what kind of works and what doesn't work. So Lee and I are hoping to take you through that, and we hope at the end as well that we can have some engagement, because many people here, of course, have published using LCT, of course, and it would be very, very useful to draw on your experiences as well. So we would like to do that. So I want to just start this process, or just thinking about why we publish. For those of us who are academics, of course, one of our biggest reasons, I guess, for publishing is unfortunately this whole sense of productivity and the measurement of our success or our productivity as lecturers over the last 10, 15 years has really become around publishing. Certainly in the university I work in, we have to produce a certain number of what are called productivity units every year. And you are assessed on that, and I'm sure that's the case for many of us. We're clearly ensconced in this era of performativity, where we focus, or the university, the neoliberal university focuses very much strongly on valuing what can be counted. And I think, although this was written sort of nearly 20 years ago by Stephen Ball, I think it's still very relevant, the sense that he talks about performativity as being, or what it requires is individual practitioners to organize themselves as a response to targets, indicators, and evaluations. And what it can lead to, it changes our identity in many ways as academics, because we tend to then set aside personal beliefs and commitments, and we start to live this existence of calculation. And I think for all of us as academics, I know for myself, it's about pushing against that, that identity, that performative identity, and actually saying, let's publish or engage because I've actually got something that I want to contribute to the scholarship in my field. And it's not just because my university manager is saying, where are your productivity units? So I guess that's really what we want to engage with, is about how do we write so we have a contribution to the scholarship in the field. And I think that was very inspiring in terms of the book launch earlier. It's very much the sense of those books and those chapters, and academics and practitioners really engaging with the real world, with the problems that we're engaging with, and writing because we want to push the field forward, not simply because we need to add to our productivity units. So really the sense, I guess, of just starting off and saying, let us write because we really want to engage in scholarly conversations about real problems and issues in the field. And what we want to argue here, what Lee and I want to just focus on is how do we then use LCT, not because it's just a a new kind of fangled language, but it's a sense of how do we really show what it brings to the field, to seeing and thinking in the field in a new way. So Lee, you're going to just give us a quick overview of what we're going to cover.
Yes, thank you. So in this session, we're going to focus on things that you should do and show you things not to do, and where certain things can go wrong in how we try to use LCT when in fact most of the field that we're talking to don't know LCT. And so yeah, this just summarizes a little bit about you know, making a contribution to your field, using concepts correctly, having a clear argument, using the support of the community, and the mistakes and the ways that sometimes LCT, the way we use it, because we speak so freely in conferences and spaces like this, that we just assume that everybody has that shared language. And we're going to just give you some guidance about focusing and just avoiding those kind of traps.
Great, thanks, Lee. So I think the very first thing that I always work with in terms of when you start writing a paper, it really is to ask this question: what is the contribution? And for those of you who are perhaps new to publishing, I find this book by Pat Thompson and Barbara Kamler just incredibly helpful. Strategies for getting published, and they just give a whole lot of very concrete ideas, as well as engagement about writing and clarity of thinking. But really this question is to start is by asking yourself, so what? What is the argument that you want to make? So it's not about saying, oh, I've done the study and here's my methodology, here's my literature, here's my findings. It's really about starting with the argument and then using the data and the empirical findings to support that particular argument and that particular point that you want to make. They also say that what's a really important thing to start thinking about, and they argue that you need to choose your journal first. It's one of the first things to do, is because it enables you to say, who is this audience that I'm writing for? Who is it that you wish to persuade? And it's, I think, particularly if one's using LCT and bringing it to a different field, like science education or history education or engineering or whatever, where people are not necessarily familiar with it, what is it that you want to convince that particular field of scholarship about? So it's really important that you know what are the particular debates in that field of scholarship, because you're entering into that particular journal discourse community. You need to enter into it as an informed participant. You need to know what are the key debates that people are talking about. So you're not just coming in from the kind of side and people are saying, but you know, why do you think this is important? There's got to be the sense of being grounded and really engaged with the field. So again, just to reiterate what the sense of, it's not just a summary of your study. And I think this is often particularly key for PhD students. What I see as an editor, often people try to summarize their whole PhD and kind of make it a little mini thesis in 8,000 words and end up just kind of following the structure of a thesis. And really a journal article is something completely different. It's really about starting with this claim or this argument and then using the findings, literature, and theory to support the argument.
Sorry, Carol, can I just add in?
So
another a way that I've sometimes explained it to PhD students and postdocs that I've worked with is that your PhD or a huge study is like a tapestry. You know, it's complex, it's got all kinds of things, but a journal article requires you to choose one coherent thread out of that tapestry. So there's a lot of cutting away, and that's we're going to pick it up again when we talk about the drafting process, to to cut down to something that then gives you that one clear argument. So don't give a snapshot of the tapestry. Find your one thread that you're going to pull out of it.
The really nice idea. I think Sharon Clarence talks about the golden thread that's got to go through, and your, as you say, your PhD has got different threads, and so how do you separate those out into the different papers? Absolutely. And I think we're all familiar with Carl's idea or maxim of saying you only need as much theory as the problem demands. And very similarly with your, when you're choosing to focus on a paper, it's about saying, what does this paper need? What is the actual problem that I'm focusing on this paper? What is the dimension? And not the sense of putting absolutely everything that you know or that you found into one paper. Which really leads to this idea of one idea, one paper. The T-shirt thing is because when I was starting out sort of 15 years ago, whatever, we had a brekkie club, which we met every week for breakfast and would discuss our papers, and people would talk and critique them. And we always thought we needed a T-shirt that said one idea, one paper. The sense that you don't put too much and too many different things into one paper. And it's really about, as Lee was saying, how do you choose the one key claim that you want to make in this one publication for this particular audience? And it's not about putting everything in. And it's a tough thing to do, particularly with a PhD, because there's often just so much there. It's really quite an art in terms of mapping out the different kinds of claims that you can make and that might be appropriate for different kinds of journals, which we will look at as well. So how do you choose the particular journal that this claim might be useful for, or most relevant for? So you might have a particular argument about methodology. And I think if we're talking about using LCT, is your particular claim that you want to say that LCT helps us to see this particular problem in a new way? So the practice theory divide, which is obviously a kind of eternal problem in all sorts of professional fields. Do you want to say that LCT really helps us to understand this problem in a new way? It gives us a new lens. It gives us a new way of engaging with the data, seeing something different. As I think Carl was saying earlier in the conference, this idea of new ways of thinking. And I think one of the key things that we've been talking a lot about LCT doing is that it enables us to bring things together instead of these dichotomies. So LCT helps us to see how theory and practice work together and can relate to each other, rather than the sense of seeing them as two completely different practices. Maybe you've got particular empirical data that you think LCT helps you to see something, in a really different way. It challenges the way that we usually think about a problem. So you might have a methodological paper, you might have particular empirical data. There's also that sense that you can use the same empirical data, and we've seen that in this conference as well, that if you use specialization dimension, it shows you particular things. Perhaps if you use semantics, it shows you something else. And so think about that. Do you want to put both of those things in the same paper, or do you want to separate out those two dimensions? So just being really clear about what is the thing, the particular argument that you want to make, and mapping out a publishing plan. So if you have the sense of these T-shirts, what is the idea or the claim in for each one of those T-shirts? And then thinking about what journal is most suitable for each of those claims. Yeah, so Lee's going to start, going to focus more on this idea. So over to you, Lee.
So I think that the first thing is that LCT studies are always grounded in real problems or in debates in your field, or something that is an issue in your field. So it's never kind of like just a paper about LCT for the sake of LCT. Maybe Carl does that, but for the rest of us, we are talking to fields. And what we're doing, and I'm just picking up on what Carol said, we're talking to something in our field, something that's an issue. But we do have this this toolkit that we're bringing to the field. So Carol, can you just go to the next the next image?
Yes, if I can find the little thingy.
There we go. Yeah,
Oh.
Okay, so the LCT gives us this toolkit. And I think that one of the things that we do is in a large study, we might draw on many of those tools at the same time, but in a journal paper, it sometimes overwhelms the paper. And then you're trying to explain the tool so much that the actual argument or the problem that you're addressing kind of gets lost in the explanation of the tools. So be clear on which tool you're using for this particular problem. And this is, I think, what Carl means by use only as much theory as what this problem situation or this journal needs, what you've got space for, what the audience can handle, and so on. So let's just think about what's in that toolkit. You might be able to draw on LCT, or you might want to draw on LCT to talk about your problem. So struggles in the epistemic pedagogic device. You know, you might want to situate your problem that you're dealing with in terms of struggles in the education arena, for example. You might want to, in your literature review, talk about a place in your field where there's knowledge blindness or knowledge myopia or knower blindness, for example, where the attention has been so much on knowers or on types of knowledge that you're forgetting the other. And so you could use these concepts to kind of open up a literature gap. You might be able to find a way of taking a concept from LCT to operationalize your concept or that you're dealing with. So for example, reflection, you might be able to say, well, we're using the idea of semantic gravity and shifts to look at how reflection moves from complex, from content dependent and less context dependence ways of talking. So in other words, you can use your LCT concept to theorize and to enact or operationalize a concept that is slippery. So that would then help. Sorry, that would then need a translation device. Okay, so what I'm saying is the LCT framework can be used to locate a gap, a literature gap, and to say this is an issue that nobody has spoken about yet, or it can be used to mine your data to actually well, what do we mean in this situation, and how does it play out in, you know, using, for example, social relations or semantic density. An example for that I chatted about a little bit earlier is in the teacher choices in action module that I've been doing. We looked at complexity in students' lessons, lesson observation reports, using semantic density. And then we had to say, well, how does semantic density play out in this study? Because it's different to how it would play out in other studies. So the translation device gives you the opportunity to say, this is how it looks here in this example, in this data that I have. You might then represent your data using planes or profiles as a way of showing what's happening. Revealing your findings, though, requires the methodology, you to use LCT as a methodological approach. So you might be able to, for example, draw out from your data different stances of groups of knowers and show how, you know, how they constellate their practices are different. So in there, you're doing a comparison. You're doing this group of actors compared to the constellating of that group of actors and how they legitimate their practice in different ways. If you're wanting to look at shifts, how practices move or they don't move or they could move, you know, you can then use the idea of waves or flat lines or shifts. If you want to look at struggles, you know, you could do it through constellation analysis. You could do it by drilling down to the code clashes or the code matches or the shifts that you see. The change over time could be represented or analyzed through the waves or through taking tours around the semantic dimension, around the autonomy dimension, and so on. So, you know, you could use your toolbox of LCT tools in different places in your paper. You don't need to use it everywhere, and you don't need to bring out all your tools in the same paper because that tends to overwhelm. So be very selective and intentional about how you're using LCT. Are you using it to set up a problem? Are you using it to operationalize another concept? Or are you using it to show shifts over time or struggles between groups of knowers? So the way that you choose to use LCT will also inform, you know, which tools, how many tools you need and at which point in your paper you bring in the LCT.
Great, thanks, Lee. So I think it really brings us back to this question, this very important question of so what and who cares? And I think sometimes what we do, particularly if we're new to LCT, we kind of get very excited about saying, yay, you know, we found a semantic wave or whatever. And that's not very helpful in terms of a contribution to the field. And I think, again, it's coming back to this question. So what does that semantic waving mean? What is the argument that you want to make? What are the implications of your findings? And I think, again, as a journal editor, sometimes I have found that some people writing in LCT, then they just kind of end with the presentation of the data as if that is the thing. You know, here's the semantic waving that I found, or these are the planes. I found that everything was in the elite code or whatever. And it really leaves the reader saying, well, so what? So it's really, really important that, again, it's about saying, so what does this mean? What is the implication of that for the field, and not just for the field in general, but what phenomenon in the field are you talking about? That it might have an implication for pedagogy, for how people, lecturers engage with their curricula and make knowledge selection choices. Are you saying it might have an implication for policy, university policy, or school policy, or for learning? So again, just the sense of exactly what does that mean and for what particular phenomenon in the field, I think is really important for you to think about.
So Carol,
yes.
So I mean, an outstanding example of that was presented in the CPUT presentation yesterday, an award-winning paper that used LCT and used shifts in semantic gravity. So that was only one LCT concept used in this paper, but it wasn't just, oh, wow, look, here's shifts in semantic gravity. They used it to show how the CAPS curriculum was unlikely to address the issue of literacy and so on, because of the way that semantic gravity went over the assessment tasks over a year. So in other words, it wasn't just showing off the tools, but it was putting those tools to use to address a concern in the field. And I think that was Morena de Lange's paper that she did with Chris Winberg and others. It just exemplifies taking one of the tools in the LCT toolbox and really working it to reveal something. And so the paper is about the problem. It's not about, gosh, look, I used this and this is what, here's a semantic wave, or yes, the semantic gravity shifts or doesn't. It's got that interpretation about the implications.
Great, nice example, Lee. Yeah. I think the next thing I wanted to just pick up on is that depending on the field, your field of scholarship, which might be teacher education or academic development, science education, whatever it is that you're speaking to, there are already concepts in that field. And I think it's really important that you show how do your LCT dimensions or concepts connect to what is already known in the field. I'm just thinking, for example, something like teacher education has already got quite a strong knowledge base about teacher knowledge, for example, that's been built up over, a number of decades. So I think if you're writing to the field of teacher education and you're choosing teacher education journals, you would need to say, this is what we already know about teacher knowledge, but this is how LCT helps us to perhaps see knowledge in a different way. But it's showing that you're already familiar with the kind of concepts and the knowledge and the grounding in that field already. Don't just bring in LCT as if it's like wow, nobody's ever thought about this before. There are a lot of fields where people have already been thinking about these ideas, but perhaps not using the same terminology. And I think if we can make those connections, it really helps us to build that idea of cumulative knowledge and not just coming in, so we don't want LCT just to be coming in as its kind of own knowledge base that doesn't link in any other way to fields of scholarship that already exist. So I guess this is the point that I'm making. What do we already know about that particular phenomenon? And then how does your use of LCT push the conversation forward? And I think that also helps us to engage with the field. I'm thinking of kind of my own field where I did my PhD was around history curriculum. I didn't use LCT because it was before that, but used Basil Bernstein. And Bernstein was not a kind of theorist that had been used in history education at all. So if I wanted to start to speak to the history education field, I needed to then make it clear that I knew what the history education field already knows about pedagogy and curriculum, and then was trying to argue, this is how I think that Bernstein's concepts can push the conversation forward. So this comes to the idea, and again, it's linking up with Thompson and Kamler's idea of being clear about which field you're writing to and who are the scholars in that field, because your article is a contribution to a discourse community and you're now joining this conversation with that community. If you're writing a chapter in an LCT book, then in a sense, you know who that community is. And I think it's very clear you can assume that the community knows LCT already. Perhaps if you're writing in higher education, we know that there's been a very strong uptake of LCT in higher education in the last decade. And you can perhaps assume also, if you choose a higher education journal, you know, that there might already be a community who understands LCT. But maybe if it's a completely new, you know, chemistry education community, for example, you might then think, well, they don't know the LCT field. So it is about saying, who do I want to read my argument, going back to this idea of what is the argument and who will care. And so being very clear about who is the discourse community. So you need to know who, you know, what are the journals in your field. You might choose specific journals, science education or maths education or engineering education or whatever, or you might choose a more general field like the higher education journals or teacher education journals. I think you also have to choose, are you taking a national or an international journal? Because that will also make a difference in terms of how much time you have to spend on the context as well as the concepts. Yeah, so are you speaking specifically to the field, or is it a journal about curriculum, for example? So if you choose the Journal of Curriculum Studies, that has its own discourse. And it's just being clear about what are the debates, the discourses, who are the people, who are the actors in those fields. So familiarizing yourself. And this is why Campbell and Thompson would argue, choose your journal first, because that enables you to write clearly with a particular audience in mind. Is it for practitioners, for academics, for policymakers? Again, where do you want to make this particular, you know, this particular claim? Which just, yeah, reiterates this point about targeting, you know, this, I guess you could put that in inverted commas, the right journal. It's really needing to be clear, what is the scope of the journal? Again, as an editor, a lot of the stuff gets rejected that is submitted simply because it doesn't fit the scope of the journal. So read carefully. What is this journal about? What is it interested in? And does your particular argument or claim fit, you know, and what are the key debates?
Carol?
Yes. Go for it.
So, you know, even in the Building Knowledge in Higher Education book, one had to make things so accessible so that even somebody who didn't know LCT would have a sense of what concepts you were using and how you were working with that.
Okay.
And if you just, even Kathy Luckett's abstract and title that you've got there, you see she's put legitimation code theory in the title. Because that's her, you know, she was bringing a new lens to looking at African philosophies, for example. But just because you use LCT or you use semantic waves or you use autonomy tours or whatever it is in your chapter or in your book, you don't need to put that in the title, especially if it is, you know, if you're talking about a real problem in your field, you might want to highlight the problem that draws people in, you know, scholars in your field in, rather than just giving the sense that, oh, this is only relevant to those in the LCT community. So you kind of bring LCT to bear on your problem rather than you know, unless you're making an LCT contribution, unless that is your contribution. But you know, so one needs to have a balance about the way in which you are foregrounding the problem or foregrounding what you're using to unpack and to dig into the problem. So you know, just there's choices. There's a range of options there about, you know, whether you emphasize the LCT or you bring it. You know, you've got a problem that you need to address, and actually LCT then brings us the tools to be able to address that in a different way or open up new insights.
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. And I think that's really helpful. And again, this choosing the particular journal, I think is really a key one, and one has to do some work before you start the writing in that field. Kamler and Thompson also argue that it can be helpful to write your abstract first. Not everybody agrees with that, but they give a really helpful, what I found a really helpful way of how do you structure your particular abstract. And I think this is really helpful because what it does is it kind of says, okay, what is this paper? Where's they're arguing, locate your paper in a particular empirical or theoretical field and show what is the research problem before you then say, this is my methodological approach and what are the findings and what are the argument. And I think this example, again, I just took it from Kathy Luckett and Kelly Loebscher. So what's interesting, you can see this is a journal of biological education. And so what they're starting with is a particular problem in that field, which is the linking between biology at high school and learners linking, remaining in university. So they're saying, even though learners do well in biology at high school, often there's not the same connection to at university. We know about this. And so what they talk about is we're going to assess some of the differences in the structuring of knowledge that exist between high school and university curriculum. So this is a kind of universal problem in higher education, and they're saying particularly in perhaps biology education. And then they simply say, so what we've done is we've analyzed a university textbook and a high school textbook using one aspect of LCT. So you can see here they don't engage with what LCT is or what semantics is in the abstract, but they focus much more on the problem and then on the findings. So I think that's just quite a helpful way to look at that. And then Lee had an example of an abstract, what not to do with an abstract.
Okay, so this came out of an LCT conference where we speak to one another in this community, and we can use that kind of restricted code because we have a shared understanding of the basic the basic concepts. But if you were a reader in a field that is not familiar, you're not talking to the LCT community, and you were looking at an abstract, and an abstract is, am I going to read this? Is this interesting for me? And you just faced with an abstract that is, I mean, how many different LCT concepts are here? And you're like, oh my word. That just sounds like it's not for me. I'm not even tempted to go and engage with the problem because it's not speaking to me. It's not speaking to the problems that I'm interested in. Whereas that other example that Carol just referred to, here's a problem. This is why it's important. This is why it's relevant to a whole lot of things. And we're going to now draw on LCT to address it. It's got that hook that would then speak to the field, not just speak to the LCT community. And so, Carol, the reviewer's comment on this paper is you want your readers to be tempted to read your papers. And if you're speaking from an LCT community to a field where LCT is not well known, firstly, it's an opportunity because it means that you can probably find insights or gaps in the literature that you really can make a huge impact. But it's important to make it accessible to those who are not part of the LCT community. And I think that's what Carl means with only use as much theory or as much of the LCT toolkit as you absolutely need to in service of this problem that's facing you, not to bring out all your toys at the once, So I just want to show you that that's what it where things can go wrong and where it can choke your argument. I just wanted to say that as part of the drafting process, you draft and draft and draft and draft over and over again. Go to the next slide, Carol. So, I mean, this is just backwards and forwards between me and a co-author. It's not unusual for me to draft and restructure papers 15, 20 times before they're eventually published. Go to the next one. You know, the first draft is really, you know, you're kind of putting on your ideas, and then you probably go through that process of elimination. And then, okay, well, this isn't working and so on. It's part of the process. Don't get frustrated with it. But to find that golden thread or that key argument, that clear argument, sometimes it takes draft after draft after draft. And so it's part of the process. What happens with a colleague and myself, Elizabeth Walton, she laughs at me because we're at the point where we've just about got a paper and we're about to resubmit, sorry, to submit to the journal for review. And in our final proofread, we'll suddenly think, oh gosh, no, this paper would work really, really well if we restructure it and we put this up front, you know, put our key claim up front and then unpack it. And the amount of times that we've been almost ready to submit and we just go back to the drawing board. It happens every time. In fact, Carol, some of the papers that you and I've written, we've done that several times as well. But that's where the magic happens. And so don't shy away from it. There really aren't shortcuts.
Thanks, Lee. I think that's, yeah, really important. And this idea of having a critical friend or writing with somebody else is also really important. I think in that kind of drafting process, that it shouldn't be a journey that's just an individual journey, and really, really helpful to have other colleagues and critical friends to comment and engage with.
Yeah, can I just, before we move on, can I just say there that the critical friend, you know, that especially, for example, like with Elizabeth, even when we're writing by ourselves, I often say to her, here's my draft, and it's very, very exposing. And you've got to be in a very vulnerable place to let somebody see a draft of your work. But I'd rather hear from you than, and I'd rather hear now what's working or not working, because sometimes when you're writing, you're so close to your own work that, you know, you kind of get lost in the detail. And to have somebody who you're working with, or who's a critical friend to you, or a community in which you're sharing your drafts and you're able to be vulnerable because it's a safe space, can just really, really help you move up to the next level. So moving on to the next point, there's a real importance of getting your use of LCT concepts and notation right. And that is because if the ground rules are clear and the way we notate is clear and consistent, you know, dimension has got a capital, you always put semantic gravity before semantic density, and you know, these kind of notation conventions, if we get that consistent, we can then move very, very quickly on to discussing the issue at stake, rather than having to then, you know, re-explain or how you're using this, because it's been used in so many different ways. So sticking to the concepts, sticking to the definitions very, very briefly, and then how it applies in your study is really quite key. And I think one of the very useful things that Carl's done is to write up what he's called the resource and architectural glossary. And you can find it in chapter 12 in knowledge building. You can also find it in the legitimation code theory website under the database of LCT publications. Because it just sets out those notations, those conventions, those fundamental definitions of the concepts. So I find myself going back to that all the time to making sure that my notation is correctly represented in my papers. So
I think we've got 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we can open up to having some discussions and questions and comments.
Excellent. So we've chatted about the fact that writing an article can feel like a long and winding road, and how important it is, or how supportive it can be to have critical friends who are absolutely invested in your success. And it's not a competition, it's a collaborative, and it's a win-win. So, you know, to have someone like that in your community is just invaluable. And, you know, so one of the things that we've tried to do in this conference, for example, is to make sure that scholars are connected in their regions, so that you can have a supportive group who know the LCT work, who can say, look, you know, you haven't unpacked it here properly, or you know, you're using this concept, develop it this way, or your notation's not right, or, you know, how you're enacting the concept is robust and is really an interesting way. So get connected with your LCT groups. Carol, if you just go on to the next slide. One of the things that we do in the LCT Hub, you know, every month or every 2 months or so on, is we have a research in progress, bring and share. And, you know, we ask the members of the Hub, you know, who wants to share some of their research. And these are some of the prompting questions that we give them to think about. You know, what's that real world problem? Start there. What's your contribution? So that, you know, just echoes what Carol's just said. Which LCT concept, analytic methodology, how are you using them? What are you finding? And so some people, I mean, this is Philip Latwayo, who is simply, he's just presenting his translation device. He doesn't have to present his entire study in a WITS Hub session, but he's got 10 minutes to present one part of it. And so he was presenting a translation device, and we were trying to, you know, just help him to refine it and cut it down to get to that essence, that core of what would really be key for his study. You can bring one piece of data and analyze it in that space. So, you know, those are really, really important spaces to bring, to share, and to create safe spaces where people can act as critical friends.
Great. Thanks, Lee. So I think what we wanted to just end with, we've got 10 more minutes. I think there are many people here, many participants who have published, and maybe you have lessons about publishing with LCT that you would like to share. I've said, please put anything in the chat if you would like to. And I see there is a question there from JP Bosman saying, what journals are LCT friendly or LCT focused, which I guess is a good question. I don't know if there's anybody. So Kirsten is responding. Critical studies in teaching and learning is quite open to LCT papers. So that's a journal within higher education, which I think is a very useful thing to know. It's an open access journal, a South African journal. So thanks for that response. Any other comments? I don't know if people want to just jump in. I'm going to stop sharing, I think, so that we can have some discussions and people can put on their videos. What else is in the chat? Okay. Any other comments that people want to make about their own experiences of publishing with LCT, where they've published, how they've dealt with comments, what kind of comments they've got from, because that's obviously the other key thing about publishing is the kind of comments that you get from your reviewers. And again, it would depend if your reviewers are LCT knowledgeable or not. Sometimes it might be helpful if you are, engaging with a field where perhaps people are not knowledgeable about LCTs. If you have a colleague who's not an LCT person, ask them to read your article and say, what are the things here that are really confusing? What is not clear? How can I make this clearer? Any other comments? Anyone want to stick up their hand or engage with these questions? Who has published? I know there are a lot of people here who have published. Kristen, do you have any comments?
I don't think so really at this stage, but maybe I can make an appeal is to this community to accept reviews when they come in. We're quite a small community, so to find people to do reviews and external examining and all of that, the pool is very small. So yeah, just to encourage people to do the reviewing if it comes your way.
Thanks, Kirsten. I think that is also just such an important thing. It's not just about the writing of the papers, but as you say, being willing to review. And certainly as a journal editor of the Journal of Education, I can very strongly acknowledge that it's often really difficult to get people to review. And I know we're all busy, we're asked to examine theses and review papers, but I guess it really is seeing it as part of our, in a sense, community engagement. And as academics, that's part of our job. And well, we don't only do it because it's part of our job, but because we do want to grow the field and try to give as much support, helpful and useful support as much as possible. I see there's another comment from Christine saying that Teaching in Higher Education, which is an international journal, I think, is also open to LCT stuff. So that's a very useful, I guess the other way to look at it is look at where are your colleagues in LCT. So if you're an LCT person working in science education, where are your LCT colleagues publishing? And that's also another helpful way to go forward.
But also, I mean, the other side of the coin is that, if you're wanting to speak to your field, do that. Don't shy away from the fact that, okay, this journal's never had LCT in before. We've published in the International Journal of European Education, where, again, but we foregrounded the problem. This is something that is of huge concern, and oh yeah, we're going to use LCT to unpack and develop it further and so on, and in that way you're coming from your position of strength in the field, and you're drawing on your tools that you have available to open up and take the conversation further. So that's don't shy away from journals that haven't used LCT, but just make it accessible and not choke the study by bringing in too many concepts. Billy, did you want to say something?
I was just commenting, yeah, down here in Sleepy Hollow, in lockdown, I felt like I was on the other side of the world, and Wits and Durban and Cape Town were all miles away, and I endured all the terrible things about Zoom, like departmental meetings, and forgot about the good things. So yeah, I'm going to have to try and get better.
I think so. Zoom has enabled us to create communities where we're not in the same place, which I think is really helpful. Yeah. There's a comment from Tanusha. Tanusha, do you want to speak about that? Saying that when I presented my PhD proposal to a group of health science academics, they were very apprehensive about LCD methodology. Is this the same reaction that other people have received? Anyone want to comment about that? Getting apprehension from your PhD panel about using LCT?
If I can jump in, it's not my PhD panel, but my colleagues all glaze over. And when I try to talk to them about integrated literacy, they just run and hide.
So I think that's quite an interesting point there, because I mean, the technical terms give you a power, they give you a precision that just cannot be captured, by kind of very more vague issues. But I think that's why particularly it's so important to really set up your problem and come to the point where it's like a no-brainer that this that this concept or this tool or whatever that you're using provides a useful way forward, and then to do it in the most accessible way, without choking your paper, so that your problem and your argument always stay key, and you don't kind of get dragged into, which is something that I've seen as in a special issue that I edited. I find a 5 or 6 page description of LCT concepts, which then completely takes you into the exotic. So you kind of you're using your tools in service of your argument all the time.
Yeah, and I think it's a learning curve for all of us, is really the sense of being able to make that, being clear about saying, what is the point? What is my contribution? And so what? Christine, do you want to say something? That'll be great.
Yes, and comment to that very important question about how to get other people to accept it. I feel one really has to read the literature in your discipline. Let's say it's physics for me, or it's health sciences. You have to go and look at what other methods have been used. Review papers are very nice for that, if one can get that. And then you should relate also what you want to do with LCT with what those other methods do. So I did a big study on that before writing a first paper, because I have to convince my people in my discipline that this is also a legitimate way of going about it, and that what I'm going to do here is very close to what somebody else did, which we already published. So it is a process. And the fact that it has been maybe not used so much in your discipline means you have that responsibility to convince and to integrate it with what has been done in the discipline. It's not easy, but if one starts reading a little bit about it, you find that there are connections. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. I think that's really, really helpful, that what we're trying to do is cumulative knowledge building. It's not bringing LCT in as some kind of thing that's just flying in, but it's saying, how does it actually support, further the discourse and the scholarship in the field. And so you've really got to show your colleagues that you know what's already been done in the field and what methodologies and what empirical findings there already are. So I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lee, for bringing me along on this on this presentation. Thanks everybody for being present. And just to see from Melissa, we all have to leave this Zoom and then join it again in a minute. So then we go on to the Makanda group. So please leave this meeting and then you will have to rejoin it. Thank you so much, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you all.